Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York. For our TV and radio audiences all around the world, I'm David Westin. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. The markets are having a bad day right now. We want to get right to them. Here is Abigail Doolittle.
Thanks, David, and you're absolutely right about that. We are looking at a very bearish day for the markets here in the U.S. The Dow, the S&P 500, and the Nasdaq at this point all down more than 1%. The tech-heavy Nasdaq leading those declines, down 1.2%. This, of course, is trade tensions between the U.S. and China do ratchet up. And we have Boeing, that's one of the bigger drags on the Dow, down 1.5%. Of course, fears that the relaunch of the 737 MAX could be delayed, plus Southwest Airlines pilots suing the company potentially for lost wages. So again, a bearish day, risk off, trade tensions ratcheting up between the U.S. and China. And this has been the story of October. When we go into the Bloomberg and take a look at a great chart, what we have here, back in August, you'll see huge swings up and down. Lots of green bars to the upside, lots of bars to the downside, greater than 1% declines. September, relatively calm. David, we're seeing a return to that big volatility. Right now, we're looking at more than 4% swings of 1% up or down. So both the bulls and the bears are vying for dominance in the month of October. But right now, we do have a decline for the month of down more than 2%. So the bears are winning. Not surprisingly, in the month of October, the month is young, but we are also seeing investors go toward havens. Take a look at this chart of the 10-year yield. We are seeing a decline of 14 basis points at 1.52%. So, of course, price trades inverse to yield. So as we have stocks declining on the month, we have bond yields also declining, telling us investors are seeking the safety of bonds. And then finally, David, where we're seeing some underperformance on the day, on this bearish day, the NASDAQ Biotech Index down 1.9%. That's one of the growthier indexes out there. Investors selling those growthier high momentum stocks, including Nectar Therapeutics, down 11%. We also have the SOX down sharply, down 2.7%. Its worst day since August 23rd. This, of course, on those ratcheted up trade tensions. The SOX, the chip index, especially sensitive to China since the supply chain is deeply embedded in China. And of course, there is the possibility of the White House blacklisting 8 tech firms. So that would be a real blow to the chip space. And one of the worst on the day there, David, down 3.7% is NVIDIA. Another weak day for the chips on trade tensions, David.
Okay, thanks very much, Abigail Doolittle. I think. I'm not sure. Now let's take a look at some of the stories that may be moving those markets all down. Sean down in Washington on the build-up to trade negotiations resuming in Washington this week. And then from London, Emma Chandra on Prime Minister Johnson's increasingly difficult path toward a Brexit deal. So, Sean, let's start with you. We have her, the leader, the vice premier, coming over for the negotiations. Are we positioning this in a way that we can get to a deal given some of the recent developments?
Well, the hope going into this week and these talks that are due to begin on Thursday was that the two sides could get to some kind of at least partial truce, something that would calm tensions, that would stop any further escalations. But the move by the Trump administration yesterday to blacklist these 8 technology companies, and these are some of the big new giants, the new champions for a lot of Chinese tech advocates in areas like artificial intelligence and video surveillance, companies like Hikvision. You know, these are big companies that are being hit by the U.S. in this move, and that just sends a terrible signal going into these talks.
So, Sean, I guess one of my questions is why yesterday, knowing that the delegation was coming over? Because as you say, this goes sort of the heart of the China 2025 program that has been so important to President Xi, and it also they brought into it human rights issues with the Uyghurs out in the western part of China. Those might be legitimate issues, but why do you wait till the very eve of the negotiations to bring it up?
Yeah, look, we've been asking that question of folks in the administration. They insist that this was on a separate track from the trade negotiations. It's simply that the announcement was ready to go yesterday. I have a hard time believing that. I think a lot of people here in Washington have a hard time believing that. This is something that a lot of hawks up on Capitol Hill, people like Senator Marco Rubio, have been pushing for. This may be, in some ways, something to appease them and any potential criticism of the Trump administration on a China deal. But if it is that, it may also derail any potential truce.
Yeah, indeed. You got a lot to report on this week. Thanks so much to Bloomberg trade reporter Sean down in Washington. Now let's go over to Emma Chandra in London. So if we didn't have enough trouble in Washington, Prime Minister Boris Johnson seems to be having some trouble with his Brexit deal.
Yeah, he really does seem to be having some trouble with his Brexit deal, saying now that a Brexit deal seems almost impossible. Now, this after a call between Prime Minister Boris Johnson and the German Chancellor Angela Merkel. We got a sense of what happened in this call from Boris Johnson's team. They said that Chancellor Angela Merkel said that Northern Ireland would need to remain in the EU customs union if any deal was to be struck that prevented the reimposition of a hard border on the island of Ireland. Now, Boris Johnson responded to that, saying that makes any deal impossible because, of course, it would mean a different set of arrangements for Northern Ireland. That then, of course, means we're now starting to see a blame game emerge between the UK and European Union leaders as to why a deal might not be possible. Of course, Boris Johnson and his team blaming the EU, saying they are failing to make any kinds of concessions. It had been hoped that they would get to some sort of agreement, at least in principle, by an EU summit that's happening next week to allow for an orderly exit by the end of the month. Now, the market reaction has been fairly stark. Certainly, if you take a look at the pound and how it's trading against the dollar, falling some 7 to 0.8% today, David, currently trading at its lowest level in a month. And we've actually seen the pound fall below its 50-day moving average. In terms of equities, we heard there from Abigail, of course, that it's a risk-off day, both sides of the Atlantic, but the FTSE closed down, but in a much better position than its other European indexes, the FTSE, of course, being fairly export-oriented.
So, Emma, I guess the question is, if he can't get a deal, what happens next? As I understand, there's an act in Parliament, the Ben Act, which says you can't go out without a deal. But are they even ready to go out without a deal? In fact, if they could get around the Ben Act, are they prepared for the possibility that as of the end of this month, they would be outside the EU?
Well, that's pretty interesting as well for us, Dave, because we heard from the government today in the UK on their planning, their preparations for a no-deal exit. Michael Gove, who is the minister in charge of no-deal Brexit planning, issued a 156-page report. He said that there are a number of challenges should the UK leave the European Union without a deal. It would include shortages of some fruits and vegetables. It would force drug makers to stockpile some medicines, and the government would have to deploy a reserve fleet of some 80 oil tankers to ensure their energy supply. But as you said, whether or not we go to a no-deal exit is contentious, of course, because of that Ben Act passed by lawmakers in September to try and prevent the UK leaving without a deal. It would force the Prime Minister to ask for an extension.
Okay, high stakes indeed. Thanks so much to Emma Chandra for her reporting from London today. Coming up later on Balance of Power, Susan Rice, former National Security Advisor and UN Ambassador under President Obama, is here to talk about what her experience can teach us about Syria and other global hotspots. Live from New York, this is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin in New York. We turn now to Mark Crumpton for Bloomberg First Word News.
David, the battle over the impeachment inquiry into President Trump continues on Capitol Hill. House Democrats say they'll subpoena the U.S. ambassador to the European Union to testify before a House panel. That after the State Department barred Gordon Sondland from appearing today at a scheduled deposition. Earlier, House Intelligence Committee Chairman Adam Schiff spoke to reporters.
The failure to produce this witness, the failure to produce these documents, we consider yet additional strong evidence of obstruction of the constitutional functions of Congress.
Text messages released last week revealed conversations between Sondland and other U.S. diplomats who were intermediaries as President Trump urged Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden's family. Sondland is a hotel executive who donated $1 million to Mr. Trump's inaugural committee. The Supreme Court appears to be divided over whether federal law protects gay employees from being fired because of their sexual orientation. Today's hour-long session suggested that gay rights advocates had a chance to win the vote of conservative Justice Neil Gorsuch, along with the court's 4 liberal members. Separately, the court is considering whether the Maine federal job bias law, known as Title VII, outlaws LGBT discrimination. There is still confusion today over U.S. policy on Turkey, Syria, and the Kurds. A senior administration official says President Trump has not endorsed a Turkish invasion of northern Syria. Late Sunday, the president announced he wouldn't stand in the way of a Turkish incursion. Republicans accused the president of abandoning Kurdish allies in Syria who've been fighting Islamic State. Turkey sees the Kurds as a security threat. The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is sounding pessimistic about a Brexit deal. The Prime Minister told German Chancellor Angela Merkel that an agreement is essentially impossible. He wants the EU to drop demands for Northern Ireland to stay in the customs union. Global News 24 hours a day, on air and at TikTok, on Twitter, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. Well, picking up on that story Mark just told us about Syria, the White House really shocked friends and foes alike when it announced late Sunday that the United States troops would not stand in the way of Turkish forces if and when they move into Kurdish areas in northeast Syria. Welcome now Bülent Alariza of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where he founded the Turkey Project. He comes to us from Washington. So, Bülent, welcome. It's good to have you with us. Let's start, first of all, with Turkey. Are they prepared to go into this region? Why haven't they done it so far after the president apparently said we won't stand in your way?
Well, it's now Tuesday evening, Turkish time, and 2 days have gone by since the conversation between Trump and Erdogan, clearing the way, apparently, for a Turkish intervention. It may be because Erdogan has been out of the country. He's in Serbia on a state visit and is due back any time. Maybe he'll make the decision for an intervention when he comes back, or it may be that he's confused by the Trump tweets that seem to contradict each other.
Explain from the Turkish point of view why this is so important to move into this area, to have an incursion into northeast Syria. Why is it critical for Turkish interests?
Well, as Erdogan and other Turkish leaders have explained it, there are really two goals. One is to push away the Syrian Kurdish YPG, with which the U.S. has cooperated against the Islamic State, away from the border, maybe up to 20 miles, as Trump and Erdogan have talked about, maybe even further away from the border, because Turkey regards the YPG as a component of the PKK, which it has been fighting for over 30 years. Second goal is to resettle maybe as much as 2 million Syrian refugees from the 4 million who are in Turkey, in Syria, just to relieve the pressure on Turkey itself. But of course, that's a massive undertaking. And the second cannot be done without the first. And as of now, even the first has not been done.
Bülent, as you said, on late Sunday when the president announced this, it caused a real reaction, at least apparently, considering what their apparent policy is, and particularly from some Republicans who support the president necessarily. Lindsey Graham, the Republican senator from South Carolina, was particularly vociferous in saying the president was wrong. This is what he said in part.
ISIS is not defeated, my friend. The biggest lie being told by the administration that ISIS is defeated. The caliphate's destroyed, but there are thousands of fighters over there, and no, the caliphate would not have been destroyed without the Kurds.
So, Bülent, as I understand it, part of the reason President Trump is saying we can pull U.S. troops out is, in fact, it's over. We've beaten Islamic State. Who's right, Lindsey Graham or the President of the United States?
Well, I think Lindsey Graham is right. And in fact, we saw this film before. At the end of December, Erdogan and Trump had a conversation. Trump announced that there would be a withdrawal from northern Syria because the fight against ISIS was over. And then Lindsey Graham and other Republican senators, along with their Democratic counterparts, pushed Trump and essentially forced him to reverse course and agreed to keep troops there. It remains to be seen whether Graham's pressure, including support from Mitch McConnell, by the way, will force Trump to do the same thing again.
Well, and particularly perhaps economic pressure, because President Trump may be backpedaling a little bit in face of all this opposition from Republicans, came out and said, look, we can control Turkey. We've done it before through economic pressure. This is part of what President Trump had to say.
That if they do anything outside of what we would think is humane, to use the word a second time, we talk about Hong Kong, we talk about this, they could suffer the wrath of an extremely decimated economy. And I've done it once. I did it with Pastor Brunson. Their currency fell at record levels, and lots of other things happened.
So, Bullitt, is the president right about that? That in fact, it's not just the troops there in the northeast of Syria, but it's also possible economic pressure that might deter him from stepping across the border?
Well, this is what's so confusing from the Turkish point of view. On the one hand, he seems to be saying, well, come on in. I understand what you want to do. And then second, he says, if you go beyond a certain limit without specifying what that limit is, I will crush you economically. Honestly, it's not clear exactly what Trump is saying to the Turks, especially as he also said today that he's going to be hosting Erdogan at the White House on November 13th. Look, Trump has done this before. He, through measures that he undertook last year, he forced down the Turkish currency against the dollar and caused a financial crisis, a mini financial crisis. He could do it, but is the point to actually work out a deal with Turkey, or to actually bring it to its knees? It's not clear.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us today, Bullitt. That's Bullitt Alariza of CSIS down in Washington. Still ahead, Richard Curtin, director of the University of Michigan Consumer Survey, will join Bloomberg's Mike McKee from the National Association for Business Economics meeting in Denver. That's next, and this is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin in New York. We're having an off day in the equity markets right now. We can see they're off of their lows, but still we're down 1% or more on the Dow Jones, on the S&P 500, and also NASDAQ. Over in bonds, however, people are buying bonds. They were up about 3 basis points, essentially, on the 10-year. It's up across the board also on European bonds. So it's basically a risk-off day, apparently in response to some of the ruminations about the trade negotiations to go on later this week in Washington. As we know, there was a blacklisting that was going on that's really made people nervous about how those trade negotiations will proceed. In the meantime, the National Association for Business Economics is meeting out in Denver, and our international policy and economics correspondent, Michael McKee, is there with an important participant. Mike?
Thank you very much. We are here with Richard Curtin. He is the director of the University of Michigan surveys. You know the sentiment surveys that we get twice a month. Never before in my memory, and this has been a long time, have people been paying so much attention to consumer sentiment. We want to know what people think about the economy, about trade wars, about impeachment, and particularly about recession these days. And I'm wondering, it's a question I have asked a lot of Fed officials. The data don't suggest we're going into recession, but Wall Street is pricing a recession. Can we talk ourselves into a recession?
I wouldn't go that far, but I would tell you that most consumers and most business and traders are uncertain. And uncertainty drives their attention to negative events. And they're looking at negative events for its implications for the overall economy. And since this period of uncertainty has lasted quite a bit, I mean, with the trade and so forth, that most people are driven towards examining almost every negative fact to see if it will impact their own lives or the economy in general.
Yeah, that was just a point you made in your presentation, that people don't look at the national numbers. They look at their own experience in trying to figure out what's going on.
Yes. And, you know, what's most important to them in jobs is what their local community, what jobs are there for their own skill set. And even in inflation and GDP, it would seem like a stretch for GDP, but there are variations across the country in how vibrant the economy is. And consumers pick up on that, and they change how their decisions about spending and savings as a result.
Well, where are we now? We've seen the consumer sentiment numbers roll over a little bit. Do you have indications that they're going to go down further?
Well, I don't think they're going to go down anytime soon. But now is the time when consumers are particularly vulnerable to a big news that is negative. You know, they've handled all of these other creeping news on trade tariffs and so forth. But we're now in a more vulnerable spot where some big shock could be exaggerated or amplified by consumers rather quickly.
Well, from your experience, how closely does sentiment track spending? In other words, is there a chance that people pull back and stop spending?
Well, all households, there's 120 million households, they don't have to pull back so much to have a big impact on the economy. And I think that our data indicate that people pull back when they're uncertain about the future, especially for discretionary purchases. And I expect that they will do that, but we have had sort of mixed news on homes have not performed that well, vehicles are flat, and this represents the kind of uncertainty people have, but they haven't taken that second step where they think, we're going to be in serious trouble and would really curtail their spending.
We're talking with Richard Curtin, the director of the University of Michigan Surveys. One last question. We only have about a minute left here. Is there a political aspect to this at this point? Can you tell us what this might mean for the 2020 elections?
Well, that's, of course, a good question. And I don't really have an answer to that. But if you look at past trends, and I have done that, the level of sentiment today would be consistent with the incumbent winning. But this is hardly a normal situation. And for the first time in 50 years, we've seen a huge partisan divide in consumer sentiment between Democrats and Republicans. And so I think the key group is the independents and how they may change in the future. And the other thing I'd say is that when we look at the data, it's the first quarter of the election year that's the critical quarter. And so that's ahead of us here.
So we'll keep an eye out for that. Thank you very much. Richard Curtin, director of the University of Michigan Surveys. We'll send it back to you.
Okay, thanks so much to Mike McKee out in Denver. That's on Bloomberg Television and Radio. In the meantime, you want to stay tuned here at 2:30 this afternoon Eastern Time, because Jay Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, will be giving his remarks out at that conference in Denver of the NABE. Up next here, on the eve of the 13th round of U.S. China trade negotiations, we're going to talk with David Dollar of the Brookings Institution. Live from New York, this is Bloomberg. From New York, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. For Bloomberg First Word News, we're going to go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, 3 Democratic House chairmen say they'll subpoena U.S. European Union Ambassador Gordon Sondland after he didn't show up for a deposition today in the Democrats' impeachment investigation. House Intelligence Committee Chairman Adam Schiff, House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Eliot Engel, and House Oversight Committee Chairman Elijah Cummings say they consider Sondland's no-show today to be, quote, obstruction of the impeachment inquiry into President Trump. The State Department told Sondland not to testify. Couples in 6 states are suing federal immigration officials, saying they were told to come to marriage interviews that ended up being traps for arrest and deportation. So-called green card interviews are a crucial step for obtaining lawful status in the United States. The months-long process typically requires couples to demonstrate the legitimacy of their marriage as part of the first step. Iran says it could turn into a companion for Saudi Arabia if the kingdom ends its war in Yemen. The countries support opposite sides in that conflict. Tensions spiked last month after a drone and missile strike on Saudi Arabia's oil industry that shook global energy markets. The U.S. and Saudi Arabia blamed Iran for the attack, a charge Tehran denies. In California, bankrupt utility PG&E has issued an unprecedented warning. It may cut power in almost 30 counties to avoid wildfires. Hot, dry winds in northern and central California have led to a fire watch. PG&E already faces an estimated $30 billion worth of wildfire liabilities. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and at TikTok, on Twitter, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. The Chinese trade delegation is due in Washington on Thursday, with Vice Premier Liu He in the lead. For a preview, we welcome now David Dollar. He's Brookings Institution's Senior Fellow for Foreign Policy, Global Economy, and Development. He comes to us from Washington. So, David, welcome back. Good to have you here. Set the stage here. What is the climate for these talks going into Thursday, given what the parties have been doing? Because that may give us some indication of what we should expect.
Right. So the climate's very difficult. On the one hand, both the U.S. and Chinese economies are slowing down. The trade war is hurting both of us, so there's some incentive for the two sides to start to make a deal. But then we have these other activities going on. The U.S. just put 28 Chinese entities on our so-called entity list because of their activities in the Uyghur minority area, Xinjiang. You've got this NBA brouhaha, so you've got a lot of stuff going on around the side. The question is, can the negotiators just focus, like a laser beam on the trade issues and reach some kind of agreement?
Well, let's talk about the blacklisting, particularly of these monitoring companies. As you say, it's tied up with the Uyghurs out in the West, also perhaps with China 2025 because it's AI, artificial intelligence companies, things like that. If you're the Chinese, can you not think that they did this on the eve of the negotiations to send a message?
Well, I think the Chinese are pretty good at segmenting these things. So Liu He has indicated he's still going to come to Washington for those talks on Thursday, Friday. I think there's still a potential for a mini deal, but certainly the Chinese they notice these actions. The U.S. has become more hostile toward China in a lot of different arenas. That's going to make it more difficult. We're going to find out pretty quickly. Can they really reach a deal?
Well, if the Chinese are good at segmenting, is President Trump and the administration good at segmenting? Because the Chinese foreign minister came out right away and said, we urge the U.S. to immediately correct its mistake, and there will be consequences if they don't do that, essentially promising, if not threatening, retaliation. That could happen even while they're having the negotiations.
Right. So that's a pretty standard Chinese response. If the U.S. is going to do something like this, there'll be a rhetorical response from China. I think they also said, stay tuned to wait for the details. So they may very well do something. But remember, they block our firms like Facebook and Twitter, which cannot operate in China. So they have a lot of restrictions in place. I think they'll probably be pretty careful about ramping those up. There'll be some kind of symbolic retaliation, but I think both sides have an interest in keeping those national security issues separate from the trade discussions.
David, you referred to perhaps a mini deal or a trimmed-down deal. Bloomberg earlier reported that, in fact, the delegation from China might well be coming and saying, we're not even going to talk about things like intellectual property or subsidies. That is not on the table right now. Let's talk about things like agricultural purchases, various trade issues, things like that. Do we have a sense of that is their approach? And can President Trump proceed on that? Because he said he wants a 100% deal or nothing at all.
Right. So the Chinese negotiator, Liu He, he's been telling foreign visitors that China is not willing to discuss its industrial policy made in China 2025. I think they are willing to talk about some of the structural issues. They're gradually opening up more markets and improving intellectual property rights. But I think the Chinese are looking for this mini deal. The U.S. is scheduled to escalate tariffs on October 15th and then further on December 15th. So what the Chinese really would like to get is a halt in the escalation. And the Chinese need our soybeans and pork. The price of pork in China is up 47% over the past year. So I think the Chinese would like to buy more agricultural products, stop the escalation from the U.S. side. That would be a first step. And whatever you want to call it, President Trump may want to say that that's not the deal. He may want to say that he's holding off on the next round of tariffs while they negotiate. But whatever you call it, right, you've got the potential to trade ag purchases for non-escalation.
We're talking with David Dollar of the Brookings Institution in Washington. In the meantime, there's a report today, David, as I'm sure you saw, that in fact the government, our government, the administration in Washington is seriously considering essentially not allowing pension plans of government pensions to invest in Chinese companies because of these allegations that have come up, frankly, on Capitol Hill that there isn't the proper disclosure of the financial data. Is that something that the Chinese would find particularly threatening?
Well, you've got a couple of issues there. You've got some Chinese companies listed in the U.S., and they're not fully following our auditing regulations. So my view is if they're not following our laws, then delisting them is a realistic option. But the larger question is, are we going to stop U.S. pension funds, particularly government-managed pension funds, from investing in Chinese companies at all? That's really complicated. A lot of Chinese companies are listed in London or Hong Kong. Are we going to stop pension funds from just pursuing the best diversification strategy? So they're looking into it. I hope they decide that those more draconian measures are just not in the U.S. interest.
David, the markets even today are very concerned clearly about the trade negotiations. Give us your best case coming out of this week.
Oh, I think the best case is pretty modest. The best case is that the U.S., the minimum case would be the U.S. says we're not going to escalate on October 15th, which is just a few days away. If the U.S. escalates on October 15th, it's hard to take these negotiations seriously. And the Chinese need the agricultural products. So I think the minimum case is we get this kind of mini deal. I don't think there's much chance beyond that. They haven't really done the foundational work to negotiate a deep agreement. So I think best case is a mini deal, and they keep talking, and that's probably going to stretch on into 2020.
Okay, David, thank you so much for being with us. Really helpful. That's David Dollar from the Brookings Institution in Washington. Coming up here, she served as President Obama's National Security Advisor, his ambassador to the United Nations, and his Assistant Secretary of State for Africa under President Clinton. Susan Rice joins us to talk about foreign policy, the Obama legacy, and what it means in today's dangerous world. That's next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Dr. Susan Rice has spent a career in public service on the National Security Council, at the State Department, as U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, and ultimately as President Obama's National Security Advisor. She's written about it all and much more in her new book, Tough Love, My Story of the Things Worth Fighting For. And Ambassador Rice joins us now for today's Conversation in Chief. Welcome. Great to have you here.
It's great to be with you, David.
And this book is full of a lot of fighting for things, the things that you believe in and things that matter. One of the things I would like to talk about, because Syria is so much in the news right now, even as we speak, is Syria, because you had to contend with that in the Obama administration.
Exactly.
Goodness knows we're contending with it today. And you say that you wrestle painfully and unsuccessfully with Syria. The human cost of the slaughter burned our collective conscience and directly implicated U.S. interests. So bring that forward today, and as we're seeing developments right now as a possible incursion from Turkey into northeast Syria. What would you teach us about that? What can we learn from that we could apply right now, today?
Well, I was writing in that passage about the Syrian civil war and the dilemma we face constantly in the Obama administration, which was to what extent should we, the United States, involve ourselves militarily in the effort to topple Assad? And at the end of the day, President Obama's judgment was, while we would help the rebels, while we would provide humanitarian assistance, while we do all the diplomacy we possibly could to try to end the conflict, we would not intervene militarily to topple Assad. He did make the decision to intervene to fight ISIS and other al-Qaeda-affiliated groups in Syria. And that's the war that has been prosecuted primarily by the Kurdish forces that President Trump yesterday announced we were abandoning. The Kurds, for all these years, have been fighting our fight, the Western fight, as well as their fight to eliminate ISIS, and had done so with our backing rather successfully. And then President Trump said, in effect, we're abandoning you, we're leaving you to the wolves, being the Turks, who had every interest in killing them. They view the Kurds as terrorists. So we've gotten out of the way, gave the Turks the all clear to slaughter the people that made it possible for us to defeat ISIS. It's a terrible, terrible betrayal. Did we defeat ISIS, or Islamic State as we call it here? Because one of the things that President Trump is saying, we don't need to keep our troops in there because we've won this war, we've beaten Islamic State, we can pull them out. Is he right? Well, we've learned this lesson, unfortunately, David, the hard way. We had to withdraw from Iraq under the Obama administration. That was a deal that President Bush before us had cut, and we fulfilled. And then, what had been a form of al-Qaeda came back in the form of ISIS. And we also had to fight the same reformed ISIS in Syria. So the lesson there is that you have to keep pressure on the terrorists. It doesn't necessarily have to be a permanent U.S. military presence. And in fact, because President Obama decided to fight ISIS in Syria differently than we'd done in Afghanistan or Iraq before, by using partner forces, the Kurds, rather than putting U.S. forces in harm's way in the thick of the combat, we were able to do so relatively economically. So we're talking about hundreds of U.S. troops that remain in Syria, not tens of thousands. And we needed to stay both to support and protect the Kurds, but also to keep an eye on ISIS so they didn't get the sense that they could easily steal a jump on us. And the other thing that's crazy, frankly, about what President Trump did is there are thousands of ISIS prisoners, terrorists who have been held in detention by the Kurds that will now be abandoned by the Kurds, and because they have no choice but to defend themselves. And those are going to be terrorists that can go back into the fight, whether on Syrian soil or in Europe or even as far as here in the United States.
One of the themes through your book, going back to some early days actually in government, is humanitarian intervention. Going back to Rwanda and some regrets you have about what wasn't done when you were not in a position of authority particularly. What about humanitarian intervention? What did you learn from your time? And let's take it forward actually to Syria right now. Should we be having troops on the ground in northeast Syria just for humanitarian reasons alone? Does that work?
I don't think that a humanitarian intervention at this stage in Syria could be effective. And we wrestled with the question of could it be effective back in the Obama administration in a different context where the fight was really not yet about ISIS. And as painful as it was, this was the passage you were reading. The president made the judgment, which I believe, as hard as it was ultimately correct, that at the end of the day, for the United States to intervene for humanitarian purposes or to topple Assad would have been prohibitively costly. And so what I've learned over the years, going back to my young days in the Clinton administration, is that you have to view these cases individually. No two circumstances are alike. There's no cookie-cutter answer to whether or not to intervene. So, for example, I've supported intervention in Libya to save lives when they were under imminent threat in Benghazi. We were able to do that without putting U.S. forces on the ground through air power, and we saved tens of thousands of lives. Now, the aftermath wasn't great.
I was going to say, Libya is not in much better shape than Syria right now, is it?
But we did something for humanitarian purposes that manifestly succeeded in saving lives. We can talk about the aftermath separately. But my point on humanitarian intervention is we have to weigh in each case, can the benefits that we can provide as the United States or leading an international coalition outweigh the risks to our interests and our security that may come with such an intervention? And in each case, the equation is different.
As you say, we have to judge each case on its own merits, as it were. Let's talk to a very different case, North Korea. That's been a problem for the United States for many years now. And it's been apparent they want to acquire nuclear weapons. Now they have done that. They're developing missile technology. When President Trump came to power, was there a path forward, a clear path forward of how to deal with North Korea?
Well, we wrestled with North Korea, as did the Bush administration before us and the Clinton administration before that. And I write in the book about my work at the United Nations when I led our efforts to impose tougher and tougher sanctions on North Korea. There isn't an obvious path forward. President Trump seemed to think with smoke and mirrors and a lot of pomp and circumstance that he could charm Kim Jong-un into giving up his nuclear weapons. He's proved that that's not the case, and not a surprise to those of us who've been working on it for a long time. Which is not to say we shouldn't try negotiation. We need to try negotiation, but we need to negotiate from a position of strength, with sanctions still strongly in place. And unfortunately, what President Trump has done is to lead the North Koreans to conclude that with some photo ops and handshakes, they can continue their nuclear program, which they are. They can continue building up their arsenal. They can continue testing missiles, and we're not going to do anything about it. Meanwhile, the Russians and the Chinese and others who were with us on the sanctions have relaxed those sanctions. So we're losing ground, even as President Trump is enjoying his beautiful letters from Kim Jong-un.
We're talking with Ambassador Susan Rice, former National Security Advisor. So, Ambassador Rice, what would you take away? What would you want us to know about the main legacy of the Obama administration when it comes to foreign policy? In your book, you go through, you had some wins, you had some losses. That's what happens in those jobs. But what were the main things you would like history to say they accomplished that?
Well, we had more wins than losses, in my estimation. And I outline in the book, from putting core al-Qaeda on the run and killing Osama bin Laden, to reviving the global economy after the economic crisis, to bringing together the world to begin to tackle climate change through the Paris Climate Agreement, eliminating Iran's capacity to develop a nuclear weapon, which unfortunately the Trump administration has undone. There are a number of, I think, very important positive developments that we were able to negotiate. But the thing that knits them all together, and I explain this in the book, is that President Obama understood that when the United States is leading from a position of strength and moral authority, and working with our allies and partners and valuing those alliances, we can together deal with the threats, whether that threat is an Ebola pandemic or Russian invasion of Ukraine, or Chinese trade competition. These are things we need our partners to tackle with us. And he was able to bring those partners along for all variety of challenges that no one country, even one as important and powerful as our own, can tackle alone. Unfortunately, now we have the opposite. We have a president who denigrates our allies, embraces our adversaries, and leaves the world guessing as to our motivations and intentions. And that, in the aggregate, makes us less safe. The other thing I try to point out, David, in the book, apart from a very personal telling of my family story and my upbringing and who I am and some of the personal challenges that I've endured as a daughter and a mother, is I want people to understand how national security decision-making works when it's working properly. It's not to say that we got every decision right in the Obama administration or the Bush or the Clinton administrations before us, but there was a process that was rigorous, that was clear, that was accountable, that informed presidential decision-making in all prior administrations. And today it's broken down completely. And decisions are made by the whim of a president through a tweet without consultation, just as this Syria announcement yesterday was. So it's very important that the American people not get inured into thinking that the momentary crazy is normal, because it's not. And if it becomes normal, we're going to be on a path to rapid decline.
There are any number of hotspots around the world, but maybe the longest, biggest, important, most story around the world is China and the rise of China. How are we handling the rise of China? Is there anything that we can do to make that better or worse, because it feels inevitable? Well,
yes, China is rising economically and technologically, and it's lifting people out of poverty at an extraordinary rate. China is going to be and is on its way to being an extremely powerful country. The question is, how does the U.S. China relationship play out? It's the most consequential bilateral relationship, and I talk about it in the book. And I share an anecdote which at the time was striking and now is even more so. When President Obama had his final meeting with Xi Jinping at the end of 2016 at the APEC summit, they were having a very friendly, cordial discussion about a range of issues. And toward the end of the meeting, Xi gets very serious, and he says to Obama, out of the blue, China does not want a trade war with the United States. But if the United States starts one, we will fight it to win. Well, President Trump started that trade war, but he did it without our allies, without them with us. And instead, we're starting trade wars with our allies in parallel. We're weaker in dealing with what is a serious Chinese challenge and in some respects a threat. And what we need is leadership that brings partners with us in order to tackle global challenges, as I described we did under the Obama administration. Yeah, foreshadowing discussion there with President Xi and President Trump. Thanks so much. Prescient. Yeah, exactly. Prescient, exactly. Thanks so much, Ambassador Susan Rice. She's the author of the new book, Tough Love, My Story of the Things Worth Fighting For. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Some news now crossing the Bloomberg on Credit Suisse. The bank is discussing a return to private banking in the United States after a 4-year absence. Bloomberg has learned that the bank may set up a new base in Miami that would cater to wealthy Latin American clients. But right now, I want to turn to our stock of the hour. It is a security camera chip maker, Ambarella. Shares are tumbling. Abigail Doolittle is going to explain why.
Well, David, this, of course, has everything to do with the Commerce Department's blacklisting of 8 Chinese these technology firms yesterday after the market closed. Two of them are Ambarella's big customers. Hikvision and Dahua account for about 25% of Ambarella's revenues. So there's fears that this could really create a near-term bump for them. Overall, 60% of Ambarella's revenues do come from the security camera chip business, and that is the high-growth area of business also for them, growing 60% in 2018. So there are fears that if there's a crimp here, that it could really take a bite out of their business. The street seems somewhat divided. Morgan Stanley saying buy on this, that it's a near-term blip. Also, if you look back to Huawei, that there was some easing around that. Other analysts not quite as positive. There is a 13% bear short interest, so some are happy about today's declines. I should mention the stock on the day, on the year, I should say, up 48%. So this is also some profit taking on headlines, similar to what we've seen all year around these trade headline whipsaws. David.
A bumpy week for tech, given trade. Okay, thanks so much to Abigail Doolittle. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we're going to talk with Bloomberg's Bill Ferries on Turkey and Syria. And we get the latest on the NBA's China controversy. Plus, at 2:30 this afternoon, you want to catch live coverage right here of Chairman Jay Powell as he speaks out in Denver. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio.